Hello, my name is Rob Earlam and I'm a Senior Technical Evangelist with Sitecore, and today I'm going to talk to you about how you can build omni-channel experiences with Sitecore Experience Edge and Mobile Blazor Bindings. But before we get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about where that idea came from. We launched Sitecore Experience Edge back at the start of the year, and as a way to introduce this to the community, the technical marketing team decided to work on a project that could showcase its potential. At Sitecore, we have a series of different developer-focused sites, things around documentation, software downloads, and community. So we realized we wanted to create a portal that would allow users to come and have a single landing page where they could shoot off and access all of these different resources. We started to decide what we wanted this to look like, and we quickly realized some key things around it. We realized most of the content was going to be static. Most of it wasn't going to change too much. It was going to be fairly consistent and change very infrequently. This led us to feel we didn't really need full WCMS functionality for this. However, there was going to be some dynamic content. If you look at the screen print here, you can see things like the latest articles and the announcement sections. You'd want those to be dynamic, whereas the rest of the page elements would be a lot more static. Because of that, we realized Sitecore Content Hub and Experience Edge for Content Hub were pretty perfect for this. It meant we could serve our imagery out of the Sitecore DAM, our digital asset management system, and serve our dynamic content pieces out of our content marketing platform, Sitecore CMP. Once we started to look at this, we realized that Next.js was a great fit for this. All of the benefits you get around static site generation meant that this would work perfectly together, and we settled on using Material UI for the design framework for it. But working on this project got me thinking. Sitecore Experience Edge is designed as an omni-channel delivery platform, and what we'd worked on here was specifically targeting the web channel. So I really wanted to look at how we could start to target a more omni-channel experience. I wanted to target more channels than just the web. If you think about omni-channel today, after the web, the second most popular channel is most likely going to be apps. Mobile apps for either Android or iOS. So this is what I wanted to work with. And it quickly came up with a couple of ideas around it. It was going to give me an opportunity to test out this omni-channel delivery platform that Sitecore had just released. And this was purely going to be a proof of concept. The Next.js site I talked about before will be going live shortly. This won't be going live, it's purely there to test out this omni-channel delivery capability. So what are we going to have? Well, similar to how I showed before, we're going to have Sitecore DAM serving our images and Sitecore CMP serving our dynamic content. This is going to be surfaced to our heads through Experience Edge for Content Hub. And then we're going to have our two different channels. I'll have my simple website, my Next.js app that I just talked about, and this new mobile app that I'm going to build. This is where I started to look into the technologies available to do that. And I stumbled across one that Microsoft released late last year called Mobile Blazor Bindings. This provided a way for you to embed a Blazor application inside of a Xamarin's Forms app. So before I go into that too much, I just want to do a quick recap on what both Xamarin and Blazor are. Xamarin is an extension to the .NET platform. It gives you a series of tools and libraries that allow you to build applications that target iOS, Android, macOS, and many other subsystems alongside that. The key thing here is that it allows you to use C# instead of having to use a dedicated language for each of those channels you want to target, which makes it so much easier. You can share code across all of them. Blazor is Microsoft's newest UI framework. It gives you a way of using C# directly in the browser. Previously, you would typically use a server-side language like C# on the server, and then you'd use JavaScript on the browser, and you'd handle the communication between the two. With the advent of Blazor, you can now use C# across your entire stack. So that means you get true code reuse, being able to share components and models between your server-side and your client-side code. It's a really powerful way of working. So along came Mobile Blazor Bindings. And I do just want to start by saying that Microsoft do say that this is an experimental technology, it's still being developed. But it's basically a way of building a native and hybrid mobile apps using C# and .NET, allowing you to target Android, iOS, Windows, and macOS. And it means you can use the Blazor programming model and Razor syntax to define your UI components. If you look at the code example on screen here, you can see we have our markup above and we have a code block below. And this is how you build these discrete components in Blazor. The code below handles some basic UI functionality, and you can reference properties and variables defined in there within the markup. In this Hello World example, you can see we have a simple integer variable. We have a button in the markup, which then basically increments that counter. Every time you click the button, the label above is going to display the incremented amount. This gives you a really nice component-based way of working, and this is one of the things I found really enjoyable when working on this project. Okay, let's take a look at this in action. Okay, so I've loaded up Visual Studio here, and when you create a Mobile Blazor Bindings solution, this is the project structure you'll get. The 4 projects you can see at the bottom are the different subsystem target projects. So we have a project that's going to build a Windows artifact, one that's going to build a macOS artifact, one that's going to build an iOS app, and one that's going to build an Android app. Each of these projects are super lightweight though, there's not actually much in there. I'm just going to focus on the Android app today. But let's take a look. We can see here we have a dub root folder which contains the index.html. This is the page that's going to host our app. There isn't much in here. But what this does do is it allows us to load in some system specific assets. Say for example you need to slightly tweak the UI on Android compared to iOS. This is how you do that. If we take a look in the main activity, here's how Xamarin creates our Android application. And you can see again, there isn't too much logic in here. Some of the key points here are where we define that this is a Blazor hybrid Android application, and also where we actually load the app itself. This load application call here is what's going to actually create the Xamarin Android application. So if most of the logic isn't in this Android project or any of the other system projects, where is it? Well, it's in this top project here. This project contains all of the Mobile Blazor Bindings logic, and it's then referenced by all the other projects. If we take a look at the app.cs here, for anyone who's worked with .NET Core before, this is going to look very familiar. Here we're specifying that this is a Mobile Blazor hybrid site. I'm also adding some services I create. And then, as we're working with a web technology here, which Blazor is, there's also a port of Material UI for Blazor. And this means that I can reuse all the HTML from my Next.js application I talked about earlier in this Blazor app. So you can see I'm loading some Material UI services to enable those. Where all the magic really happens though, is in this Web UI folder. This is where the actual Blazor application lives. For anyone who's worked with Blazor before, the structure of the folders and files within here is going to look very familiar. If we take a look at the app.razor, this is the entry point for a Blazor application. You can see we define a router which is going to handle all the different routing within our site. And then we have 2 options in there. If the route's been found, we're going to execute that route with all the data provided, and we're going to render the main layout, which is what controls the layout for this actual application. If the route isn't found, then we're going to basically render the main layout again, but this time we're going to pass in some information saying that that address doesn't exist. There's nothing at that route. And this is how you handle your 404 scenarios. You'll also notice that this entire route is being wrapped in a theme provider. That's something that's part of Material UI, which allows the library to style the different components I'm going to work with. So let's start by taking a look at that main layout. This is pretty empty. A lot of the time you'll see a main layout that's way more complex than this. But for this simple scenario, all I'm doing is adding in my main navigation menu, and then we're going to render out the body of the route being loaded. So looking at that nav menu, where does it actually live? That's obviously not a standard HTML tag. Well, when working with Blazor, you work with the concept of components. And if we look in this components folder, you can see we have a nav menu component in there. As soon as you create a Razor component in this way, you can then reference it as a tag, as if it's a HTML tag. which is a really powerful way to work. That means we can drop this nav menu component on anywhere, any page we like within our site. If we take a look inside there, we can see we have all of the markup that's needed to render our navigation control. Now, for those of you who've used Material UI before, this markup should look very familiar. We have containers and grid elements, and then we have standard nav UI components, things like our main Sitecore logo, and down below we have our actual navigation elements. One thing that's a little annoying with this is you'll notice I'm having to fully qualify some of the tags here. There's also a grid component in Xamarin, as well as there is in this Material UI library. So at this point I have to fully qualify which grid component it is I'm actually trying to render. If we scroll down here, you can see we also start to implement some basic UI logic. When working with Blazor, you get these code blocks at the bottom, which allows you to embed small pieces of C# code in with your markup. Here you can see we have a property to define whether my menu is collapsed or not. And we have a CSS class that leverages that property to define whether to apply the hidden CSS class or the standard grid item one when it's being shown. We also have the method in here that's going to toggle that state. So anytime that method gets called, the collapsed nav menu property will toggle between true and false, basically open and closing the navigation menu. And we can embed those properties and methods directly in the markup. If we go back up here, you can see we have a button here, and the onClick handler for that button is calling that method. So every time that button is clicked, it's going to toggle that variable state. If we look a little further down, we can see the variable is being output as the class for the actual menu itself. So every time that button's clicked, it's going to toggle that class and in turn basically show and hide the menu. So that's basically showing how we have the main layout configured. Let's start to look at one of the pages we have. I'm going to go and load up the index page. This is the main home page for the app we're building. And you can see we have a few more components here. We have a hero banner, we have a little bit of markup and then some call to action cards. And then below we have latest news and articles component. I'm going to start with the hero banner. And you'll notice, again, this is a component we've built. But this time we're actually passing some variables in. We have a title and a subtitle that's going to be rendered. So let's see how they're used within the component. In here, you can see we now have a code block below with our two properties. But these now have the parameter attribute assigned to them. And what that means is that you can set these externally. So whenever you drop the hero banner into a page, you set those two properties, the title and the subtitle, and those values will automatically be passed in. And you can see above in the markup that they're being output. You can see we have our title and we have our subtitle. And this is how you start to get real component reuse when working with Blazor. It means that you can use this home banner on multiple pages with different text being output on each of them. So let's hop back to the index page now. The call to action cards is pretty straightforward. It's static content again, so I'm going to skip over that. The next one I want to look at though is this latest news and articles, because this one starts to get a little more complex, because here's where we're starting to deal with dynamic content. The first thing you'll notice here is that we're injecting an announcement service here. What this does is it allows us to inject classes to be leveraged within this Blazor component. And that's really important. These code blocks at the bottom are great for having little simple UI switches like we saw before. But once you get to more complex type coding scenarios, you don't want to have that embedded inside your code block. You want to move that externally so that it keeps this clean, and also possibly so you can reuse that. Looking at the control here, again we have some standard Material UI components. But inside there, we then start to work with an announcements property. If we look at the code block below, we can see we have this announcements property, and it's a list of an announcement object. Next we have an implementation of the onInitialized async method. This is a standard method in Blazor, and it gets called every time a component's rendered. So this is where you can hook in to execute initial pieces of code as the component is rendered. Here you can see we're leveraging that announcement service that was injected in, and we're going to call a method on there to get the top announcements. We also have a bit of polling code on there to do a refresh every 10 seconds. You wouldn't do that in production, but this is pretty handy for the demo. Now we have that announcements property being populated, we can look at the markup above to see how it's used. And we start off with a simple if statement. What we're saying here is, if the announcements is null, then we're just going to render a loading tag. And that's because this markup is going to get rendered onto the page before that announcement's property set. So before we start to work with it, we just want to display some loading text for the user to let them know that something's happening in the background. Once that announcement's property's been set, the if statement will toggle, and then we'll get the other side of the statement. So now we're going to iterate through each of the announcements in the collection, and we're going to render another component. We're going to render this single announcement component, and we're going to use a parameter on it to pass in that announcement object that was returned. If we take a look into that component itself, you can see again we have some standard material UI elements. Our code block below has our announcement object defined as a parameter because it's set externally. And then we use the properties on that announcement object to basically set different elements in the UI. We're outputting the title of the announcement, the description, and also the link URL this is going to forward onto. If we take a look in that service itself, we can see it's pretty basic. The Sitecore Experience Edge for Content Hub endpoint that I'm using is just a GraphQL endpoint. So all we need to use is basic GraphQL.net. Here we set the URL that we're calling to, the URL of our Content Hub Edge instance. We set our API key that has been defined in Content Hub. And then we run some very basic GraphQL, getting me the announcement results defined in the system. After that, with this being C#, we get all the strongly typed goodness we're used to. So we can pass the result of that into a strongly typed announcements object. And that'll give us our strongly typed announcement that we saw earlier and the collection we're iterating through in our component. Okay, let's take a look at it in action. When you install Xamarin, you get a series of extra tools in Visual Studio. And as I said, I'm just going to focus on the Android ones today. And I'm going to load up the Android Device Manager. This will show us any emulated devices I've created. I've set up one, it's going to emulate a Pixel 3a. We hit start, and this is now going to give us an emulated Android device. We can see the device starting up, and for anyone who's used Android themselves, this is going to look very familiar. Where this gets really fun now is if I hop back to Visual Studio, I'm going to set the Android project as my startup project. After that, I'm going to hit F5, and this is now going to build my Android artifact. It's going to build the Blazor application we just saw. It's going to embed it into a Xamarin Forms app. And then it's going to build an Android artifact. Once that's happened, it will then take this code, connect to that emulator, and push it over there as a real native app running on that emulator. And here we can see the app's loaded. We can start off by seeing the nav menu at the top, and we can see the burger menu with that button we created with the UI logic. Clicking on it switches that class we looked at. So here's how we have the show and hide logic for that menu item. Looking further down, we can see that we have the hero banner with those two text elements that we passed in as parameters. Moving on, we have the call to action buttons. And then if we keep scrolling down, we can see our announcements control, and we can see the dynamic content being pulled out of Content Hub through Experience Edge. These different boxes are each different content items in Content Hub, so this is the dynamic content that's being pulled through. I'm going to hop back to Visual Studio and I'm just going to stop that connection now. So that was a pretty good POC, but I got thinking of how I could make this even better. And what I started to wonder about is, what if I changed this so that the web channel as well was built in Blazor, in the same technology? That would allow for a much better code reuse scenario as well. So let's take a look at how that'd work. Okay, I've moved the code base along here, and you can see the solution structure's changed a little bit. I'm going to start by looking in this apps folder. And here you can see the same 5 projects we saw before. I have my 4 system target projects for Windows, macOS, iOS, and Android. And I have my main Mobile Blazor Bindings project. If I look in there, I can still see my Web UI folder has my Blazor application. But if I expand that, you can see the components and the services are no longer there. And that's because I've moved these out into separate projects, these components and data projects down at the bottom. If we look at my dependencies on this app now, we can see I've added those in as project level dependencies. So my Mobile Blazor Binding project is now referencing these two other projects. If we look at the data project first, you can see I've moved my announcements service and my related model down there. I've also created a news service. We've got some extra data being pulled out of Content Hub now, and that exists in here as well, along with the models it needs. But this gets interesting with the components folder. Here you can see all the components that were previously in the components folder directly in my Mobile Blazor Bindings app. And we're referencing them now through a project reference instead. If I look at my index page from before, the code's exactly the same. It hasn't really changed at all. You can see I'm still using the hero banner tag here. I'm referencing the hero banner component. But instead of that component being in my project, it's referenced from another project, from that components project. And that's because this component project is what's called a Razor Component Library, or an RCL. So if I go and look at my hero banner now, the code in there hasn't changed. It's exactly the same as before, but it's no longer tied to my Mobile Blazor Bindings project. If I go and look at my nav menu from before, if you remember, previously I had to fully qualify a lot of the tags that I was using in here. Because my component had been defined in the Xamarin project, there was a lot of Xamarin context there that was causing namespace clashes. Now I've moved this component out of there into its own project. There's no Xamarin references in this project, it's just straight Blazor. That means there's no namespace clashes, which means I only have one grid reference pointing to my material UI grid. So I've been able to clean up a lot of the UI in here. It's much nicer now, but everything still runs exactly the same. I have my Android project set as my startup project still. So once more, I'm going to hit F5 and we're going to run this in the emulator again. And here we can see the app's loaded up, just like it did before. You can see the codebase has moved on a little bit. We now have some nice imagery in the hero banner as well. And if I move down, we also have some latest news being output. Again, dynamic content being pulled out of Content Hub. If I keep going, then you can see we have our announcements. So, really the mobile app experience hasn't changed too much. I'm going to stop this now. So that's nice. We've been able to tidy up the markup a bit. But as I said, what if we started to share those components for the web? And this is where I realized things could get really interesting. I also introduced here this web folder. And this project inside is a standard Blazor WASM project. Just like with the Xamarin application, you can see I've also referenced my components and my data. The two projects which house the functionality that was extracted out of the Mobile Blazor Bindings project. So if we look in here, you can see we have an index page, the same as the Mobile Blazor Bindings index page for the application. And much in the same way, it's rendering out the hero banner, the call to action cards, and the latest news and articles. If I look at my main layout though, you can see this is slightly different. In this scenario, this is building for the web, so we don't really need that burger menu. We're going to have the menu permanently available. So I haven't used the nav menu out of the shared components library. Instead, I've built my own version of the nav menu, just web specific. It's very similar, but if we scroll to the bottom, you can see there's no code block. We don't need the UI logic contained in there. So what that means is you could build a web experience using shared components, but you could override certain components where you want to have channel specific functionality. So I'm going to switch my startup project over to this web project, and I'm going to run this in Visual Studio. You can see straight away we get the browser loaded and we have the site here. At the top you can see we have the web channel specific nav menu, no burger menu being rendered. You can see we have our call to action, and then below we have our two dynamic elements. We have our latest news and we have our announcements. And this is now really powerful. Now we have true code reuse between both our mobile applications, our desktop applications for Mac OS and Windows, because our Mobile Blazor Binding project's targeted there as well, and our web channel. So let's say, for example, at some point we wanted to add an author to our latest news content here. I'm going to hop back to Visual Studio. All you'd have to do is go into the data section. We'd update our news model to include an author property. We'd update our news service, the GraphQL query in here, to pull back the author data out of Content Hub. We'd go into our component library. We'd load up our news and articles section, and you can see we have an area for our news articles here. So all we'd have to do is include that new property in our markup here. After you've done that, 3 file edits you've made, you've now updated the code for your web channel, for your Android app and iOS app, and for your Mac OS and Windows desktop programs if you're publishing those as well. So this means you can make changes and fixes just in one location and have that truly shared across all of your different multi-channel delivery methods you're working with. It's a really powerful development scenario. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to follow the Learn Sitecore hashtag for future videos.